Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe to, download, and review the Groundless Ground on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, and of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? This is a very special episode featuring Judson Brewer, MD, PhD, addiction psychiatrist, author, app developer, and associate professor of psychiatry at Brown University School of Medicine. Judd is a seasoned researcher of mindfulness interventions for addiction and developer of novel habit change apps for abating anxiety and craving. A longtime Buddhist meditation practitioner, Judd is a relentless data hound, not an evangelist. He was among the first researchers to use real-time neurofeedback and fMRI to study meditation and its effects. Our dialogue is devoid of hype and chock full of useful insights on addiction, its true causes, and empirically-based self-applied applications for cessating craving, urges, and unwanted substance use. Judd, it is a real honor to have you take time to be here on the Groundless Ground podcast. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
So we've known each other for quite a while, and we've seen a lot in the mindfulness world.
Yes, we have.
You do so many different things. Unlike other researchers, your work is really important because it's practical and people can use some of the tools that you're delivering. I want to get a sense from you how you envision your place in the mindfulness world, as well as in the neuroscience research world, and also the mental health world. Like, where do you see yourself at this point in your work and career?
The main guiding compass for me, honestly, is suffering. In my clinical work as an addiction psychiatrist, I see a lot of suffering. I haven't seen great tools for addressing that. And so all of my work, all of my lab's work is geared toward understanding how the mind works and developing pragmatic tools to help people work with their minds and overcome bad habits and addictions. That's my North Star. That's my compass.
As an addiction psychiatrist, how would you define mental health?
That's a great question. Words matter, and I think mean so many different things to different people. So I would just say pragmatically, the simplest way that I would think about it is not suffering. And the opposite of that would be flourishing. So where we're flourishing, we're not caught up in anxiety. We're not worrying. We're not stuck in an addictive habit loop. And we're really connected with the world, not disconnected.
Addiction is such an interesting phenomenon, don't you think?
Yes.
There's so many problems with how people think about people who suffer with a substance addiction. Somehow, if you have an addiction to a substance, you're living an existence that not only people can't understand, but there isn't anything else in a normal person's mind that's going on. That's something like that. It may not be as extreme as that, but there's something like that a person without substance use problem might actually be suffering from that's similar.
Yes, I think we all share this, and it's the degree to which it causes problems that makes us and sometimes arbitrarily define something as an addiction or not. I like the simple definition, continued use despite adverse consequences. We can all look at our own behaviors. How many times are we picking up our phone? Cornel West calls these our weapons of mass distraction. So how much are we picking up our phones despite adverse consequences? That could be minor at first. We're not necessarily going to lose our job, but it might affect our interactions with our significant others, our families, our kids. Another example, people don't think of anxiety as a continued use despite adverse consequences. And there's a lot of interesting research showing that worry, in particular, one of these core components of anxiety, can be reinforced in very much the same way that other chemical or classic addictions are. So I think as we learn more about how the brain works, we all have a much better and more nuanced understanding of what addiction is, what continued use despite adverse consequences really means. And then we can all look at ourselves and see, oh, wait a minute. Maybe I'm fitting into this spectrum as well. And even, especially if we look at the updated Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, like the Psychiatric Bible, where they now have this checklist of 11 items. And so depending on how many items you have, there's kind of more of a continuum of severity as compared to you have abuse or dependence, which is more black and white. Oh, if I don't make the cutoff, I'm not whatever. Well, the reality is, let's just look how many things we can really see manifest in our own lives.
One of the tricky things, particularly your great example of our relationship to our devices, there's a lot of disconnection and loneliness in the way our culture lives.
Yes.
And I live in Silicon Valley, where device culture has been in the culture for a very long time, especially relationally. Honestly, this is a very disconnected place and always has been in terms of human one-to-one connection and friendships and things like that. The device itself is a source of pleasure.
Or is it?
So this is why I'm bringing this up, because it's always this double-edged sword. There are ways in which the device actually creates good experience, connective experience for people. And then there's also a way in which the device is a gateway to take something like that and turn it into what would become something that gets in the way of daily activities and a sense of joy in life. And I think a lot of trouble happens when people can't make this distinction.
I agree.
So what are we doing as clinicians to help people make this distinction in a way that it's not been made? Because the ways it's been made are so extreme, I don't think people can actually relate to it.
I've seen some kind of anti-technology almost rants where people say, oh, just stop using whatever. And it's kind of like saying, if we're trying to cook dinner, it's like saying, well, stop using your chef knives because they're sharp and they could cut you. Kind of hard to cut a tomato with your finger. Here, if we understand how the software is designed psychologically, then we can work with it. The phone, it can help us navigate a city that we might not be familiar with. So here, I think it starts with understanding our minds, because a lot of the technology is now built around basic psychological processes, and particularly the addictive elements of these. At its core, it's about reward-based learning. Some call it operant conditioning, where this process that was set up to help us remember where food was is still literally the core learning mechanism that we use in modern day. Silicon Valley knows this, and they can say, well, this is how people learn. Let's help them learn how to use our apps, which is fine. I'm not saying this is a terrible thing. What I'm saying is, if we understand how the process works ourselves, then we can learn how to use our phones responsibly. It's like drinking alcohol. That core process, it can be distilled down into 3 elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. And if we understand how that works, both in terms of pleasant things, holding on to and getting pleasant things, and then also removing punishing things. Like if there's a behavior that feels good, we keep doing it. If there's a behavior that feels bad, we stop doing it. This learning process is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So knowing those basic principles already puts us much farther down the road of understanding how our minds work. And in that way also puts us back in the driver's seat.
It's true. Apparently, it appears to be straightforward. Although in my clinical work, especially around, I'd say anxiety is a really good example. Anxiety feels bad. On the other hand, what I find is people are choosing anxious states because they're familiar and they have decided that there's something they don't want to go near that they think is worse, like, for instance, an actual emotion or their actual life. They stay within this anxious mind because it's familiar and it feels safe. Even though they suffer, they convince themselves it feels better. The trickiness of the human mind.
Right. So one piece to understand there, and I think anxiety is a great example because it is not straightforward. Anxiety in particular, and there's great work by Borkovic and other researchers, he was out of Penn State, that really shows that anxiety can be negatively reinforced, especially with worry thinking. It's helpful to know what this process was set up for. Our brain is set up to try to predict the future. Anything that's uncertain is going to feel uncomfortable. If something feels certain, our brain says, great, I can predict that, so it feels better. Then, wow, I have no idea how this is going to go. And the worry comes in as we try to project ourselves into the future. we simulate basically and are simulating, okay, what if I do this? What if I do this? What if I do this? The simulations can be helpful. So for example, if it's the weekend and we're trying to decide, if there are two parties we were invited to, something like going to this party versus going to this party, and if we can simulate it well enough, our brain's not going to say, well, I want to go to the party that's going to suck,
Unless you're a masochist.
Right. So it's going to go to the party that it's going to simulate and find more rewarding. But if there's complete uncertainty, and this is where worry comes in, fear of the future. Oh no, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. It kind of gets caught in this endless worry thought loop that in itself drives more anxiety. We can just map this out. So if anxiety is the trigger, or there's an unpleasant emotion, like you talk about, it's a trigger, the mental behavior is that we start to worry as a way to try to feel like we're more in control. And then the result is either that avoidance or feeling of control feels a little bit better than the negative emotion. But then when our brain starts to get wise to this and it just is realizing, well, I'm just worrying, worry feels terrible, the worry then spirals on itself because it becomes the trigger that triggers more worry, and then on and on and on and on. And then it gets stuck. It goes over this event horizon into the black hole of anxiety.
Yes.
That's really how anxiety can even become its own addictive behavior, so to speak. It's not our fault. It's just our brain trying to help us survive, trying to help us predict the future. Yet in unpredictable times, especially when there's tons of information around, we get all this information overload. And so our brain says, well, if I just get more information, then I might be able to figure it out. Which of course, when we try to think through things rationally, our brain can't hold that much information in its working memory at one time.
This is actually why the work that you've been doing for so long, which is landing in the embodied reality as it is, allowing the awareness to settle into the world and the body, is so freeing, because that's a form of information that the brain doesn't have to predict. It's just there. It unhooks the brain from having to rely on the internal VR machine, which is never accurate. All that assessing, all that scenario making really can never come close to the infinite numbers of possibilities that life itself is going to throw in front of a person.
Yeah.
Which makes anxiety activity very unsatisfying in the end. Frankly, it's the same with depressive thinking, which is just the other side of the coin. There's just a lot of collapse in the system.
You can just think of it as rumination. So are we ruminating about the past? This is an overgeneralization, but I think it's pretty true. If we're ruminating about the past a lot, we fall into the depressive category. If we're ruminating about the future, it tends to fall into anxiety. And there are a lot of people with comorbid depression and anxiety.
So let's put all this together, because the three things we've just talked about, addiction, unpleasant activity of the mind, and actually technology, we can put these all together because you have been using technology. You've been very involved in building apps to allow people to experience directly craving, what it's like, what it is, and have a different relationship with a substance. You've also been an app for anxiety to help people understand anxiety better. And I think there's also an eating app as well.
Yes, we are specifically using the technology to help people work with their addictions. Well, back when we were starting this research, there weren't even smartphones around. And we were getting some very interesting clinical results with some of the mindfulness tools that we were testing. I'd done some work with alcohol and cocaine use disorders and found that mindfulness was as good as cognitive behavioral therapy in helping people not relapse. And then started doing work with smoking cessation and found that it was actually 5 times better than cognitive therapy for helping people quit smoking. At that time, I realized people don't learn to smoke in my office. They don't learn to stress eat in my office. They don't learn to get anxious. Hopefully they don't get anxious in my office. I had this aha moment. This system was set up as context-dependent memory learning, where we learn things in context. So what if I packaged my office and brought it to my patients? Would it be more helpful because it's really right in context? Could it be more accessible? Could it be less expensive? Could it be, all these things that we're looking for with population health level change? Can we make something that is available to many, many people, but still maintains high fidelity and is efficacious? So we started developing, app-based trainings. Started with smoking, with the Craving to Quit app, and I'll circle back to that one in a minute because we actually just finished a big neuroimaging study with that one. from that one, we were finding when people were pilot testing it, they were saying that they were changing their eating behaviors. I wasn't thinking too much of that because typically people gain about 15 pounds when they quit smoking. What they said to me was they were actually cutting down on their stress eating and their snacking. And my eyes popped out of my head. And I said, what? I made this assumption. It's like, well, of course they're going to gain weight. But they said, no, they were doing the opposite. And that's when I actually realized that this habit loop was set up around eating. And actually that's where it started. And so we developed this Eat Right Now program and did our first study actually in collaboration with Ashley Mason at UCSF, and found a 40% reduction in craving-related eating in women who are obese or overweight. And mechanistically, it was doing the same thing that we were seeing with the Craving the Quit program, where it was decoupling craving and eating, where people could have an urge and they could ride out that urge. It was really interesting because mechanistically, we were starting to dive into the reward-based learning process on a direct level. How rewarding is this stuff in the first place?
Exactly.
So, and let's put a pin in that. Let's come back to that as well. Just to finish the story, with that program, people were saying, this is really helpful. And I never realized that anxiety is a big trigger for me to eat. And so I started looking into the anxiety and I was like, wait a minute, this is the same thing. So we developed the anxiety program that's called Unwinding Anxiety and started studying it. And we were finding a dose response effect where as people made it through about module 21, they were having like a 46% reduction in clinically validated anxiety measures. Made it to module 28, they were going up to like 47%. So we were starting to see a nice effect, close to 50% reduction in anxiety after basically 3 weeks of a program. So we then did a clinical study with the most recalcitrant population I could think of. I was like, if we can do it with these guys, we can do it with anybody. So we started studying physicians, because there's this epidemic of physician burnout right now. This is all clinicians, I think. Autonomy is decreasing, the electronic medical records, a pain in everybody's ass. All these things are causing clinician burnout. And we don't learn in medical school how to become resilient. Well, we learn how to put up our armor and show how tough we are. That's not such a great idea because that armor starts to rust. And then, when it rains, we can't move because we're stuck, bound up by anxiety. Long story short, we did a study with physicians. We found a 57% reduction in anxiety symptoms. And we threw in a few measures around burnout. The program doesn't mention burnout at all, but anxiety and we actually found that anxiety and burnout are correlated pretty highly. It was like a 0.71. Lo and behold, we got a 50% reduction in burnout in one of the subscales. We only looked at a couple of subscales, but each of these had significant reductions because the two are correlated. And as they learned to work with their anxiety, there were actually related factors, such as callousness was the one that was the biggest drop. But it was interesting, emotional exhaustion dropped significantly, but not as much as callousness, because their circumstances haven't changed it. They're still working in an environment that's probably not as optimized and as helpful as it could be. The institutional factors, those need to be focused on. But there are some individual factors that can actually be addressed, anxiety in particular, that can help people reduce things like callousness and become more reconnected with their patients. We're seeing a convergence. And what I look for from a mechanistic perspective is I want to see the same types of mechanistic changes across a bunch of different populations, because that shows that something is really true. It's not just some one-off or here's one study, that maybe had some anomalous finding. We're seeing this with smoking. We're seeing this with eating. We're seeing this with anxiety. Importantly, we're seeing people reporting this in their own experience. So we have online communities as part of these programs, and people can write about their experience, and they're reporting this dramatic shift. They used to identify as being anxious, and now they see anxiety as physical sensations in their body, and that these physical sensations don't have to drive them. They're writing out full-blown panic attacks this way, which blew my mind because I didn't think that a program like this would work that well. But we've had a number of people who are reporting, I just noticed the sensations, they come and go. And honestly, myself, when I was in residency training, I used to have panic attacks. And I've been practicing for about 10 years at that time myself, and I was using mindfulness to ride those out. Was able to kind of note them and not get sucked into the worry of, oh no, I'm going to have another one, which then leads into full-blown panic disorder. So fortunately for me, and we're seeing this with folks in our program, is that they can ride out these panic attacks and realize that they do have control. The paradox being that by not doing anything and simply being with the sensations, control they need.
The way all of this is being envisioned, it's still very brain based. So when the awareness is aware of a physical sensation as it is, what's really happening is the nervous system is so ecstatic that that mind is with the body. What's driving the body is literally the narrative. There's nothing in the environment that's frightening. The body's in a situation where it just naturally knows where it is and it will just not be in panic. So when the awareness is finally with the system itself, everything calms down. People think they suddenly have control because they're aware of the sensation. So now they're thinking, oh, if I'm aware of my sensations, I can calm the body down. But in fact, it's the other way around. And the result occurs naturally because you're finally where you really are, which is probably not in a war zone. You probably don't have a tiger in front of you. You're probably not in a set of adverse conditions, certainly not the adverse conditions your mind has been telling the body it's in and driving it into these kinds of fear states.
I totally agree. The control is not about doing anything. Like I need to calm myself down. That by completely letting go almost sounds like a koan. How is letting go equal control? That's the secret or the non-secret, right? It's what is actually helping us not get caught up.
So one of my curious questions about your apps and the research you're doing, one of the problems with MBSR was there wasn't a lot of teasing out all the different practices that they were giving and which ones are really like the killer app. You have been building these apps, so I'm wondering if you've built them in such a way, because I'm assuming you're delivering several different kinds of things they can do in order to experience their anxiety differently. Have you found in your research that there are certain skills or particular exercises that you're offering that really work for them?
And I think this goes all the way back to our first studies with smoking. One thing that really blew my mind, because I had hypothesized the opposite. This is where I get to test to see, am I truly a scientist, where I'm willing to look at the data and be objective, or am I some evangelist trying to put forward some idea or concept that I'm attached to? I had this hypothesis that it would be formal meditation practices that would drive things. And we looked at our data and we collected data both from formal and informal practices where we'd have people work with their cravings in the moment that they came up. And we found that both were correlated with outcomes, but the informal practices formally moderated a decoupling of the craving and smoking. And so we had to pay attention to that. If you look historically, and I'm not a historian, the Tibetan Buddhist practices focus a lot more on in the moment. And I love this phrase, short moments many times, where as we go through the day, we have opportunities to become aware and see if we're caught up in habit or not. So we took those to heart and said, okay, this is what the data are showing. Let's actually develop the apps based on the data. And so we introduced the informal practices first. And it actually starts with helping people really understand this habit loop. It's day one of each of the programs. How is my mind working? Because if we don't understand how the mind works, one of the terms I think in the Tibetan practices can be translated as familiarization. We need to familiarize ourselves with our minds. So if we familiarize ourselves with how our minds work, we're going to have a much better chance of working with them. It seems obvious to me now. So we introduced the informal practices first, helping people be with their experience, whether it's a craving for food or whether it's with worry, helping them really see what that experience is for what it is. Oh, these are physical sensations. These are thoughts. These are emotions. These are not me. And then we layer in formal practices to help people have a solid grounding as they go throughout their day. Yet those are specifically and slowly introduced as people are learning how their mind works more and more. So they see how the formal practices fit. I wish I had learned in that order. For me, it was like sit down, meditate, and wrestle with my mind, try to get it under control. And I would always end up bruised and beaten and, sweating through t-shirts in the middle of meditation retreats. And so I could see what didn't work on a personal level, yet I didn't want that to drive my program. People can fall into rabbit holes where they think, oh, this worked really well for me, so therefore it's going to work really well for everyone. For me, I really want to take a mechanistic approach and follow the data and say, okay, here's something that's working on a population level. Here's the underlying mechanism. Let's put all those together and then look for clinical efficacy. I'm happy with our results. I can always do better. And if we had to stop today, I'm very happy with what we're seeing. Our clinical studies are pretty solid.
Well, you and I are completely on the same page. I pretty much have stopped delivering formal meditation practice to my patients unless they ask. Everything that I do with them is always what would be considered informal. But for me, this is the essence of mind training, is being able to offer people some kind of direct insight into the actuality of experience and uncouple the kind of false identity around the way they've been envisioning who they are based on some internal narrative that isn't true about themselves and the world. And that requires informal practice in the room during the session with my patients. But then they get to take that and work it all week long, because 1 hour with me, what is it going to do?
Right.
I'm really excited because honestly, all the mindfulness researchers that I've talked to over the years, I've never actually had anybody affirm this for me in the way you've just done it.
And that's my experience clinically as well.
But people are very married to the practices. And of course, this is coming from somebody who's still doing an hour of Tibetan practice every day. So I am not saying that there isn't a value in formal meditation practice.
You're pointing out something really important, and I think I would refer people back to the historical teachings. In very summary fashion, the Buddha said, attachment to views causes suffering. And so if we become attached to a view of this is the way it is, the only thing that I could predict with close to certainty is the result of that is going to be suffering, as in, it has to be this type of practice, or it has to be that type of practice. This is why I think in Zen, they talk about the 84,000 Dharma doors. It's about seeing the nuanced aspect of how each of our minds work. And there's an underlying structure. This is why there are 4 noble truths. There aren't a gazillion noble truths. There's a cause of suffering. And this underlying cause is common to all of us, yet how it manifests, and therefore how we work with it, is going to be pretty individual. Yet that working with it has a common underlying element. If we can understand how our mind works, then we can start to see how that suffering is manifesting for us. And then we can personalize our practice, to be most efficacious.
So how about if you and I talk about the state of mindfulness research? You've always been doing different stuff than many of the other mindfulness researchers, wouldn't you say?
Some similar, some different, yes. Well, I've been in the field a while. I've had the privilege of being able to do a lot of work and a lot of different work. When I first started getting into this research around 2004, I think, you could almost count the number of papers that were published on 2 hands, maybe include your toes, but there weren't many. I'm so fortunate that I've been practicing for over a decade myself to really kind of get a sense for where to look. I think it's hard to formulate questions around non-conceptual experience without having had experience with the experience. I was blessed with not ever having thought about doing mindfulness research for over a decade before thinking about doing it. And so in that sense, it's been really helpful for how I formulate the questions that my lab studies. And it's also been helpful, honestly, to have a clinical practice, because I can see where the rubber meets the road, where people are suffering, and I can also test stuff out. So let's dive into some of the research. Maybe a good place to look at this is we just finished a study looking at the Craving to Quit app, the smoking app that we have. We had looked at some experienced meditators and novice meditators just to get a sense for how the brain is activating or deactivating during a bunch of different types of meditation. And it pinpointed a network of brain regions, this default mode network, that theoretically fits pretty well with selfing, right? Because it's a self-referential brain network. It gets activated when we get caught up in craving, when we ruminate, when we perseverate, when we worry, all these things. So it lines up pretty nicely. And we had done some work originally. I think our first study was back in 2011 was when we published that, and found that across a bunch of different meditation practices, this network was quiet in experienced meditators. We'd gone on to do some neurophenomenologic work where we could use real-time neurofeedback as a way to line up people's subjective experience with their brain activity. And this is where we started to pinpoint that it's that getting caught up aspect. It's not just the craving itself, but it's the getting caught up in whatever it is that seems to be correlated with at least the posterior cingulate cortex. And from there, we could formulate a hypothesis to say, okay, if this is the neural mechanism, let's see if this actually correlates with clinical outcomes. So we just finished an NIH-funded study to look at the Craving to Quit app. We worked with Amy Janes at Harvard. She had this great smoking paradigm where she basically scans people's brains while they look at smoking images, and posterior cingulate lights up like a Christmas tree when they see smoking images because they get caught up in that. We could scan them at baseline, look at their activity, and then randomize them to get Craving to Quit or the National Cancer Institute's app. And then a month later, we could scan them again and see if changes in that brain activity predicted clinical outcomes. So here we could prospectively link up neural mechanism with a specific intervention that theoretically targets that brain region or that network. And we could line that up with clinical outcomes. And the long story short was that we saw very strongly significant correlation between a reduction in posterior cingulate activity and a reduction in cigarette smoking, only in the Craving to Quit app. No correlation in the control app at all.
Do you think this is because the Craving to Quit app, which frankly, I send people to all the time and it works. Do you think it's because that app is so good at targeting the truth about wanting? It really shifts an individual's delusion about what they're actually getting. So that once they realize what they thought they were getting is not what they're actually getting, and that the actual experience of smoking is gross, and they really do have this experience, the PCC story of wanting just falls away.
Yeah. Well, I see that not only in the smoking program, but I see it with the Eat Right Now program, with their eating program. And we've also seen this with the anxiety program, where people just become disenchanted with these old ways of doing things where their brains are caught up, which also fits with this reward-based learning paradigm. Because not only do we become disenchanted with this old behavior, what's it like when I eat a whole sleeve of Oreos? It doesn't feel very good. So we're less excited to do that the next time if we can bring that awareness and remember, oh, this is what it was like last time, right? As we simulate into the future, the simulations are based on past experience. But at the same time, that opens the door for what I think of as the BBO, the bigger, better offer. Have you heard this term?
No, tell me.
Where it came from, or if I just made it up. But anyway, it's helpful to think about a bigger, better offer, because that's what our brain's always doing. It's constantly comparing. If it starts to see that one behavior is not that rewarding, that opens up the space for the BBO. Oh, well, what is more rewarding? I don't know anything that's more intrinsically rewarding than being with our experience, being totally connected and curious about our lived experience moment to moment. So it opens the door for us to just drop in and see how rewarding mindfulness practices are themselves. This is why I love curiosity. This feels great and we don't become habituated to it, right? It's not like, oh, if I feel anxious, I go look at cute puppy videos on YouTube or something, because our brain says, okay, this is nice. And then it gets habituated and it's like, well, I need cuter puppies, or I need puppies and kittens, and I need puppies, kittens, and babies. We're going to run out of cute things to look at. But here we can just turn toward our experience and be curious about it and actually hack that reward-based learning system itself. So instead of looking externally, we're triggered by anxiety or stress or whatever, and instead of eating or worrying, we substitute curiosity and we turn that curiosity right toward that experience itself. We can flip the valence from unpleasant craving to curiosity, which feels better. And then that's intrinsically rewarding, and our brain says, I'll have some more, please.
Because presence is so rich and it's so natural. And it's the one thing that, for me, modern culture cuts off in people very early in their lives. It's very difficult to settle in a nervous system that is either agitated or collapsed chronically. And I would say pretty much everyone I've ever worked with in all these years I've been doing this, who has any kind of difficult relationship to a substance, has the underlying nervous system dysregulation that's driving the entire need to try to ameliorate it through a substance. Capacity for presence is the key. People don't realize that what they're aware of, they'll say, I'm aware, but what they're aware of is some internal story, not the actuality of their embodied experience. Would you say that the crux of the quote unquote mindfulness research that you're doing is actually, in fact, research on how to allow people to experience presence?
Yes. And the piece there is it doesn't start with trying to teach them practices themselves because it's so easy to get caught up in the concept of a practice. It starts with kind of helping to rub their nose in their direct experience so that they can see how painful it is and also understand how their mind is habitually trying to fix things and that the fixing is actually making things worse, or at least in the least, it's perpetuating the problem.
Yeah, that's an authentically Buddhist intervention.
Oh yeah, I'm just following the manual, so to speak. And the manual is life, direct experience. And so our research really helps to point to and bring the signal out of the noise because there's a bunch of stuff that's happening. It's hard to figure out what it is that's causally connected. But if we can actually do these carefully controlled clinical studies, we can start to see, okay, here's the mechanism of how this works. And then and that mechanism happens to line up perfectly with the Buddhist theory. It's awesome because I don't have to defend my theories. I don't care. I just want to find what's going to reduce suffering for people. We might as well start with what has outcompeted everything else from an evolutionary perspective. If you take a Darwinian view, nothing else has outcompeted these simple concepts for thousands of years, literally thousands of years.
How do you think we can have an impact on addiction treatment in general at this point? Because it's such a mess.
Yes. So here I would say as clinicians, so for any clinicians listening, it's about really understanding our own minds and understanding that commonality of the human experience, because then we will be able to put ourselves in our patient's shoes much more readily and easily, and we won't mistake their experience or make assumptions. That's the first place to start. Is if we can't understand our own experience, how the heck are we going to understand anybody else's? From that wisdom, that's where we can really make a difference, because we won't just be formulaically saying, oh, do this, or I'm going to write you a prescription for this, or I'm going to follow some manual. But we'll really understand where somebody's suffering is coming from. We'll really understand where they're tripping themselves up. And from there, instead of putting a Band-Aid on, we can get right to the source, clean out the wound, and provide the right treatment. And that right treatment is then helping our patients understand their own minds. I think of this as like a very simple 3-step process where it's like, 1 is help them map out their mind. 2, help them see how being caught in those habit loops is not that helpful for them. Intrinsically, not in a thinking way, but in an embodied way, so that they become motivated to change. And then 3 is to really get a taste for the bigger, better offer, whether it's curiosity, kindness, connection, all these things that help us move from that scared little tight ball to this open, connected being.
It's a dopamine-rich experience because it's always different.
Well, I would be careful about saying dopamine-rich experience.
Really?
So dopamine is set up to help us remember where things are, and it also is set up to motivate behavior. Dopamine, from what I've seen, both my research and many others, is it actually makes us restless and drives us to do something. And this has been shown pretty clearly where, we first get that dopamine hit when there's something surprising, and that helps us learn something new. Oh, here's this food source. And then it starts firing in anticipation of receipt of reward. That firing in anticipation says, go get it, go get it, go get it. So my patients with any type of addiction, they're not chill. They say that they feel restless as all get out until they call their dealer. And that anticipation piece is their dopamine going crazy, firing, saying, do this, do this, do this. That is so different than the peace and calm and joy that comes with any of these mindfulness practices. We haven't done these specific studies ourselves, but I would eat my shoe, as one of my old professors used to say, if this is a dopamine related thing. I'm almost certain mindfulness has got to be some other or combination of other neuropeptides or neurotransmitters.
So that would be such an interesting place to do research, because obviously experiences like awe and wonder and interest, these states are pleasurable. There must be some other kind of pleasure that's not necessarily reward network associated, both in the body as well as in the brain.
Yeah. And I think that gets down to direct experience. So we can all explore this ourselves. So for example, there's a difference between excitement. Excitement gets us all contracted, like, ooh, and joy, which is more open and connected. Like curiosity, does curiosity feel more contracted or expanded as compared to excitement?
So that openness itself, if it's not dopamine mediated, there must be some other thing in place when you're experiencing openness, curiosity, awe.
Yes. And until we figure that out, the good news is we can all experience this in our own direct experience. We don't need radio tracers to try to map out the neural systems. We can use our own bodies as the playground or the laboratory and explore, oh, what's it like to want something, to be caught up in a craving? What's it like to be curious about that craving? And we can start to see that flip right there in that moment. And right there is a rich, rich moment of mindfulness. Oh, this is craving. Oh, this is curiosity.
You've totally blown my mind, Judd. Now you've made me incredibly curious. Now I know there's no dopamine running around in my brain. It's something else. I know we are coming to the end of our time. You do go around, you train people, you teach people. So I think you're coming here pretty soon.
Yes, I'll be leading a benefit retreat at the 1440 Multiversity at their campus there. Probably the easiest way for folks to kind of get updates on these trainings and whatnot is just to follow me on Twitter at Judd Brewer, or go to my website, drjudd.com. There's information for this retreat, which is coming up mid-April. It's a weekend. 100% of the proceeds will go to help create scholarships for underserved and underrepresented minorities in my lab. Be at the 1440 Foundation exploring the difference between craving and curiosity, for example. Some meditation, combining that with conceptual learning. Folks are interested in the apps. They can find more resources on drjudd.com as well. Craving to Quit, the Eat Right Now, and the Unwinding Anxiety program.
If somebody wants to support your research at Brown, is there a way for people to be able to support the research?
Oh, I would love that. Yes. They can just send me an email, judson.brewer@brown.edu, if they're interested in supporting any of the work we do, whether it's scholarships for underrepresented minorities or any of the research that we do.
Because I really think that of all the mindfulness researchers, you spend so much of your energy working on addiction. And this is a place where, as you said, the rubber meets the road, and these practices really help people. They create change almost effortlessly. Once you point somebody in the right direction, it's as though the mind is already set up to have these kinds of insights and then just allow the experiences to unfold for people.
Yes, that's the aim. And I'll actually mention one more thing for any clinicians listening to this. I just put together a series of short video-based trainings that'll be free to introduce people to where willpower fails. For example, some of the research and efficacy studies around mindfulness, how we can hack this reward-based learning system. Those will be available probably through my website. We'll link people to the CME and the CEUs to get continuing education credits for that. That won't be available for the next couple of weeks, but they can certainly bookmark our website or again, follow me on Twitter, and I'll announce when those things will be available. The aim here is just to provide a resource for people to learn, good, accurate, and up-to-date information on these things. One of the bonus modules is around clinicians learning to work with empathy fatigue, develop resilience.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time. It was great to have you on the show.
It was my pleasure. This was really fun.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.